Hello, I'm Claire Poole and welcome to the Climate of Sport podcast, the show in which you get the inside track on all things sport and sustainability globally. Join me every week where I'll be chatting to a special guest about news, opinion and insights on how sport is moving to a more environmentally friendly future or taking action on climate change. Hi everyone and welcome to the first ever episode of the Climate of Sport, the new podcast that we're bringing you, looking at all things sport and sustainability and climate action in the world of sport globally. I am absolutely delighted that the first guest on this podcast is Matthew Campelli. Matt's the founder of the Sustainability Report and many of you will know him and his work really well. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Claire. Thanks for having me on the show. It's really strange to be this side of the mic today. So I'm really looking forward to it. I love it.
I absolutely love it. You're always the one asking the questions. But as we've said, this is totally a chat and a conversation. I'm not grilling you at all. And that I think just in terms of the podcast and what we want to do with this is really have conversations with leaders in the world of sport and sustainability and talk about some of the things that maybe are happening behind the scenes or, you know, we discuss a lot inside the community. And if people are new to the community, they are just wrapping their heads around. So hopefully those of you who've joined us today for this episode will enjoy lots of inside track, lots of learnings, insights, opinions, etc. from Matt and I, who've both been active in this space for quite a while. So, Matt, just in case people have been under a rock or are brand new to the space and they're not yet across the output of the sustainability report, can you just give a little intro, like how long you've been doing it, what it is, and kind of your work in the area?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I got into the kind of sport and sustainability space about four or 5 years ago now, and that was really born out of I'm a big sports fan, obviously, and I suppose this is a bit of a cliche. Everyone mentions that when they first talk about sport and sustainability. But I kind of got to the stage where I was a sports journalist. I was writing about sport, and I really felt that sport needed to be doing more around big issues like the environment. So I started the Sustainability Report about 4 years ago to really focus on key areas of work sport was doing, looking at leaders in sport who were doing some good work in environmental sustainability, fighting climate change, but also to try and feed in some lessons from other industries to kind of help sport, because sport is not so mature in this area as I think we can agree on at this stage, although it's grown in the past 4 years. But really, it was a good opportunity to kind of help sport by showcasing some really, really good lessons. So that's really how it came about. And we've been doing it for about 4 years now. We do articles, do podcasts, do a lot of podcasts now, but really trying to focus on how sustainability can really improve sport and how sport can really have a big say in sustainability. So kind of two-way street.
Yeah, but and anyone who reads the articles on the sustainability report, you know, it has really become, from my perspective, it's become really the place that people go to who are in the industry, who, you know, not just for news and stuff when things are released, but also for opinion, bigger thought pieces, hearing more from leaders, etc. So I think if anyone is new to the industry and isn't aware of Matt's work at the Sustainability Report, it's one to check in. That's one of the ones we check every day, sign up to the newsletter, etc., because it's brilliant. I was thinking as you were talking there, I think the first time we met was in a car park in Katowice in Poland after the launch of Sports for Climate Action Framework in COP24. That would have been, I remember getting a coach back to the airport and I'm sure we bumped into each other like in the car somewhere around the edges of Katowice. I was trying to think where we first met, and this image of a dark car park popped into my head in the middle of nowhere in Katowice in Poland.
Well, I don't know if people were thinking about me as stalking dark car parks at night. But,
well, I was there too. It was where all the coaches were leaving for different parts of Europe to take people home. And I feel like that's maybe where we met, but I could be wrong. Maybe we met inside the COP and that just stuck in my head more. I can't remember.
Well, we met there, but I think the first time we actually met, and maybe you don't remember this because you were running around like a crazy woman, was in Amsterdam a couple of months before that for the Sport and Sustainable Innovation Summit, I think.
Yes. Gosh, yeah. So that must have been 2017.
No, it was the second one I went to. I was April or May 2018, I think.
Wow. So 4 years. So I've been kind of cracking away in the space for maybe 3 or 4 years by then. That book, well, that's, you've got a better memory than me. That just popped into my head. Anyway, we digress. But in terms of that, the sustainability report, and I think the output from that's so incredible, and it's such a resource for the industry. But I loved it because you said you're not usually this side of the camera of having the questions asked to you. You're always the one doing the question. But can you tell us some of the stuff that you feel the output, it's been a long time. I'm sure you have to go back into the recesses of your mind. But is there any articles or stories that you did that really stick out, either from you in terms of something that you thought, wow, things are really changing, or that had such a reaction in terms of being read or shared, etc.? Is there any sort of stories that stick out for you in that way?
Well, the stuff that tends to do really well, a couple of threads. Obviously, athletes. Well, we'll talk about athletes a little bit more going down the line, because I think that's really important. But secondly, I think things that are really quite theoretical, actually, which I suppose is a little bit counterintuitive, but things that are slightly different and slightly outside the box do really well. So when we look at strategy and different ways of doing strategy, looking at really honing in on particular sustainability topics rather than doing a big strategy with 400 objectives and that kind of stuff, really looking at different ways to look at that. And also another thing that we've really looked at is how sustainability can really help sport with its key metrics like fan engagement and engaging sponsors, because I think if you talk about it in a silo, you tend to lose a large proportion of the sporting crowd, apart from the people that are really switched on. One of the really interesting things that I've heard recently, and it'd be interesting to find out from your perspective, Claire, because you've probably heard a little bit about this, is I wrote an article about how sustainability can help sports brands kind of reposition themselves as lifestyle brands based on this panel session I had at Leaders a few months ago, where I think it was Williams F1 team were saying, look, we're seeing sustainability as a way to engage people who don't care about Formula One. They won't watch the race on a Sunday, but they may well be engaged in our social media channels, some of other content, may even buy 1 or 2 bits of merchandise because they really want to be part of our brand. And I thought that was a really interesting concept. But I don't know, have you heard much about this space?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. And I really like that lifestyle engagement kind of side rather than fan engagement. I think that's a really interesting use of words, because I do hear about this and we do talk about it quite a lot. So when we think of sports fan engagement, we think of absolute diehard fans of a certain club or a certain sport or whatever, and then we're trying to say, do those fans care about the environment? How can we move the needle on that, etc.? But there's a huge tranche of quote unquote fans that are totally fair weather. They enjoy watching certain things, or as you said, through lifestyle. And I think Paris Saint-Germain is a great example of that, where people who aren't even Paris Saint-Germain fans are wearing the merchandise because it's become seen in a certain way in certain subcultures, etc. And, as part of our cultural zeitgeist in different parts of the world. And these little pockets pop up where you see kids who've got no interest in football wearing all the merch because of what that represents. It's on trend, basically, isn't it? So those, I think, those lifestyle factors are really interesting. And I think that, actually, in a recording we did, which will be out after this podcast goes out, that I just spoke to Maddie Orr about, who you know very well as well. We were talking about this, and she was talking about the same thing of like the people who, are going to games or going to, whether it's a game or going to an F1 race or whatever, as someone's date or as someone's mum or as someone's, friend or whatever, that they've got a spare ticket and they go along. And then all of a sudden they're in this world that isn't really their world, but they're seeing what it is. And then they see, oh, this isn't really my thing, but this organization's doing stuff that, connects with my ethics and my lifestyle and my, the things that I'm interested in. So then they can gain fans in that way. So I think there's a huge amount to unpack in this area. And I think the fan engagement pieces are very, very, very interesting. And this purpose-driven activations as well, I think we're seeing loads more of that as well, in terms of, previously organizations had partners or sponsors, and then there were certain activations in certain ways. Now we're seeing so much more purpose behind those and using that visibility that they've got for something that's a little bit more than just buy our stuff, which I think is, again, another big move in terms of bringing in environmental sustainability into sport as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The thing that I find interesting about the fan engagement piece, and I think this will evolve quite a bit in the coming years, because I think we look at fans, and this is not just from a sustainability point of view, this is from a general point of view, is that we see fans as this homogenous group of people, like they're all the same. All the people that come to the stadium are the same. Whereas, okay, if I go to follow my football team, we all have that in common. We all like the same football team, but I've got political views of my own. I've got societal views of my own. I think about things in a very different way to maybe the man or woman sitting next to me in the football stadium, and it's how we try and kind of appeal to different people with different behaviors and different attitudes, because you won't capture everyone. And I think it's
No.
crazy to try and capture everyone, but to try and pick out different demographics and see how we can speak to them at their level with a bit of empathy to try and really engage them in this conversation. That'd be really interesting going forward, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And also acknowledge that there is going to be a portion of sport fans who's going to be very, very difficult to move on this space, but there is other tranches who'll be very, very open to it and will serve as influencers to other parts, etc. And in terms of that work, what really springs to mind when you're talking about that, about fans not being a homogenous group, is the work that Britain Talks Climate have done, which has nothing to do with sport. It's about society at large and citizens and affiliations. But again, thinking about how we communicate on climate change, that's, if you're listening and you're interested, have a look at their work, because they break down, as you said, political, societal views, religious views, educational, interest in certain areas, etc. And they break down, I think it's 7 groups that in the UK you can break down people by in terms of where they land. And with that in mind, how it's best to communicate with those groups on climate change, i.e. messaging that's going to land in a way that they care about and might drive positive behaviours. So nothing to do with sport, but I think a lot of learnings in there for sport that we can look at in terms of not just thinking about fan engagement as you said, well, they all support this team or they all love this athlete, so let's treat them all the same. So yeah, I think that the fan engage, and obviously, as we know, the fan engagement piece is the most exciting piece of this, isn't it? Because in terms of, once we get ourselves in order, that's the benefit of sport. That's the reach sport has that so few other sectors have. And I know we've still got work to do to be credible and authentic in that space across the board in terms of doing the work ourselves. But I think the fan engagement piece is so exciting because of the possibility of that and the reach that sport's got.
Yeah. I did a podcast last week, which I was speaking to someone a little bit outside of the sport and sustainability wheelhouse, and it was a behavioral scientist called Christina Kravert, who's from Denmark, and she was talking about this concept called nudging, which is like you put people in a certain scenario and you see how it kind of changes their behavior. So, for example, if we talk about the stadium point of view, so when you go to the kiosk to buy your food or drink from the stadium, rather than having the kind of beef burgers up top and like 1 or 2 vegan or vegetarian options down at the bottom of the menu, how would that change people's decisions if you had the vegan stuff really prominent and like the meat or the non-plant-based stuff, quite small on the menu? Like they still have the choice. You're not forbidding them from buying it, but would that change their behaviors? And I think that's a really interesting conversation about how people in charge of sports arenas or events can perhaps alter things in a slightly different way to facilitate these changes and give a little bit of a push.
I love that as well. I think that we had a speaker at the summit a couple of years ago whose name unfortunately escapes me now, but she was incredible. And they'd done a huge amount, I think it was at Cambridge University, they'd done a huge amount of research in canteens there, and the fact of how many more plant-based sales increased when you just increase the number of options available. So instead of having 1 in 4 plant-based options, you change that to 2 in 4. And then, as you said, the meat options are still available, but there's just the more options there are, people stop thinking about it as meat or vegan. They think, oh, that, veggie curry looks nice, I'll have that, rather than I'm going for the vegan option. So those sorts of behaviors, I think, as you said, are really interesting. And I think, again, it's about the I think that's a really important point about the availability of it, because in some of our work that we do on sport positive leagues, that there'll be people will give us information of like vegan options are available on request, either in hospitality or for players or academy or different areas behind the scenes or to staff. And I think I'm fairly plant-based, but I still am a bit flexitarian because I think I don't want to be a pain in the bum. I think if there's something there that, has got some animal-based products in, I'm not going to make people go out of their way. I'll just sort of make do with what's there. And I think that mentality as well, it's about, as you said, if we're nudging people towards positive behaviors, it has to be available and it has to be visible and it has to look incredibly attractive, and it has to be delicious food, obviously, as well. In these situations, it has to look like an attractive option, and then people will go for it. But the more difficult we make it, as you said, if it's less visible or if it's on request, etc., we are dissuading people from those behaviors. So we'll have to catch that. So that podcast's available about this nudging behavior on the Sustainability Reports podcast.
Yeah, it is. Amazing. But actually, going back a point or two, because we spoke about the sustainability report, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the Sport Positive Summit last year, because I think there's been a huge opportunity for you to talk about some of the things that you learned during that. This might be a good opportunity in this podcast. And particularly you spoke a few minutes ago about the fan engagement piece. Sport needs to do a little bit more to get its own house in order before really going full throttle with that. What did we learn about that at last year's Sport Positive Summit? Were there any things that kind of jumped out at you?
Yeah, I think that's thank you. I never really sort of chat to people directly about the summit, but I never really talk about it outwardly. I think that we always have fan engagement as such a big piece of the summit and the output. But I think the big learnings, I think for me, at a macro level, in terms of not just the speakers we had in there talking about that, who were superb and brought lots of different perspectives into that conversation. So we had Tom Gribben from Planet Super League, who are obviously doing great work in encouraging positive behaviour in people's own lives through the love of their football team. Then we had Laura McCallum from Protect Our Winters, who are working in the outdoors space and are really working in it in an advocacy way. So again, a little bit broader than fan engagement, but more sort of citizen engagement within the outdoor sports community through Protect Our Winters UK. And then Jack Groh, who does a lot of work for NFL Green and has been responsible for a lot of the fan engagement at the Super Bowls in recent years, around stuff like recycling and green teams and moving to more sustainable products and stuff, and engaging fans with that through giving away free merchandise that you can't get anywhere else that sort of says you're a green champion. And then, it's something really exclusive and interesting and makes people feel good, fans feel good about recycling. So brilliant examples in terms of the speakers there. But in terms of the general conversations, I think, as you said, the macro takeaway is that there's still this reticence from a lot of sports organizations to go too far on the fan engagement piece until they feel comfortable that they are doing everything themselves. So if they feel as though they're not where they should be in terms of reducing their own impact, they have a concern about credibility in terms of getting this messaging out. So I think at a macro level, I think that's where I'm seeing it. And I'd love to get your thoughts if you feel this is reflected through your conversations. And I feel like that's still a sort of holding people back. I also feel like people ask a lot, are fans demanding this yet? Which across the board, we can say, not really. But in some cases there are. We're starting to see more sustainable fan groups, splinter groups pop up, etc., and people starting to use their voices more. But also, I wonder, and I have no empirical evidence to support this, what I'm about to say, but I wonder if, when we say, are fans demanding this, whether citizens at large feel it's appropriate to demand that of certain organisations, because in terms of societal change on the environment, we see it from government, we see it from civil society, we see it from religious groups, we see it from business, we see it from all different sides. And I wonder, even within those, are citizens generally tend to talk about it. Maybe they demand it from businesses. We know they demand it from government. But I wonder if and when we'll ever get to a stage that fans do start demanding it from sports, because generally if it's a team sport or a club that they follow, they're not following that organisation because of their environmental metrics, but it could help alignment with their goals if sports organisations do this. So there's this, I find that fascinating about if and when we'll see that change. But also, as you said, in terms of the wider metrics, the fact that clubs can probably increase their fan base through doing this great stuff, as we've seen with Forest Green Rovers, who are a smaller League One club here in the UK in the English Football League, and they now have fans from all over the world because they're a vegan football club and sustainability is the heart of everything they do, and they have global fans because of that, not necessarily because of the football. So there's so many different facets to it. I think it's a huge topic, but I think they're the kind of the takeaways we saw at the summit, but also some of the questions I think that are still out there about this space.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So I think, speaking from a football fan's perspective, I think you're right. I think that fans, citizens being a better word, will in many ways not hold football clubs or sports organizations to account in the same way they will for multinational organizations or governments, because they'll see a brand that produces clothes, for example, or a supermarket chain that sells food, and they'll see the environmental impacts are very obvious, I think. So this has been produced from something, this material came from somewhere, someone somewhere in the world has produced this. I'm not sure what conditions they've produced this in, and energy has been used to produce this as well. So it's very obvious there's an environmental impact attached to that. Whereas I think if you're a football fan and you go and watch the football, the only product you really see is what's happening on the pitch. You see the players play, and win, lose or draw, that's what you buy your ticket for. That is the product of the football team. And I still think there's a bit of a disconnect between what fans think about sport, what they think sport produces and what it's for, really. And I suppose the other thing at the same time is that many football fans are a little bit concerned about football clubs being perceived as businesses. Like they want their club to be a club, and if it's perceived as a business, the shareholders making money, like in cases like Arsenal Football Club, for example, where they see that where the fans perceive that the main shareholders are making money, they don't care much about what's happening on the pitch. They don't like that. Whereas I suppose counterintuitively, if football clubs become more like businesses and start behaving more like businesses, they may start to take sustainability seriously, like businesses do, like producing sustainability reports annually, having sustainability strategies, hiring people in sustainability roles. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect there, but also a little bit of tension there between, should a football club operate like a business, and will fans accept them operating like a business, even if there are some positive outcomes from that?
I think so much in this space, and I know there's people globally doing like Professor Brian McCullough and others in the sport ecology group and more broadly who are doing great work on this in terms of fan engagement, and even conversations I've had recently with sort of sponsors and partners of sports organizations that are starting to look at this in terms of campaigns that they run and what the data and metrics are on that, and how fans of certain sports are engaging with certain areas. But I think as well, there's so much to tackle on the fan engagement piece. But another point that you mentioned there, just to move on a little bit, is the athlete side, because actually a lot of the times, Matt, as we both know, people are fans of the athletes, sometimes more than the clubs, or more times more than the sport, or more than
nowadays, right? Yeah.
I mean, they're huge influencers on social media, etc. And I know from some research I saw recently that colleagues have put together, I'm not sure if it's public yet, so I won't name them, and I'll just talk about it more generally, but just the way the people who have influenced our society over time, starting hundreds of years ago with artists and poets and writers and cultural leaders, then into politicians, and now very much into athletes and sports stars, in terms of society at large, who influences behaviours. And athletes are such a huge part of that now, that the role of athletes is something we can't not talk about in this space, is it? Of what, yes, they have an impact in terms of their job and the work that they do, but the platform they've got to reach people in a way that resonates is massive, isn't it?
Yeah, it is massive. It is massive. I suppose from a fan's point of view, I guess they want to know that the athlete's genuine. I think that's the crux of the conversation here, is that anyone can use their voice and stand up in front of campaigns, but if they don't see them, if they see them phoning it in and not practicing what they're preaching, I think that can almost be a negative thing. I think athletes who are doing genuine work, people like Melissa Wilson, Hannah Mills, Morton Thorsby at Sampdoria, who is a top level football player but lives probably not as many top level football players live, basically, using that that generalization, but people who are actually not just using their platforms, social media, but actually in their spare time doing stuff to make a difference, going to meet governments or going to meet NGOs, creating strategies, creating programs for other athletes to follow. You're actually doing something to move the conversation forward. I think that's the crucial step for athletes, I think, if they're going to be genuine about it. But I don't know, what have you seen in this space recently?
Yeah, no, I think again, this space is so interesting because, as you said, there's this credibility and authenticity issue in that, as you said, society at large has got such a quick cancel culture.
It does.
Have a, oh my God, knee jerk. But sometimes it's for good reason, and sometimes it might be a bit much. But I think, as you said, athletes have to be credible and authentic in the space to be able to use their platform to the best of their ability. And as you said, actually be doing genuine stuff in their own lives to have that impact. But also there is a line as well where some parts of the internet, some darker parts of the internet will tear people down, because these athletes, they do have to travel for work. They do have to, there's this, whilst they might do everything they possibly can in their own power and care about it deeply and passionately, they still, because of their work, they do have to travel. They do have an environmental impact. They probably do have perhaps a higher disposable income than other people, and therefore perhaps consume more or are seen with more sort of within the production and consumption cycle. So I think there's a middle ground for sure, where it has to be real, and it has to be honest, and it has to be authentic. But we also have to accept that the same way as business people travel to meetings, or they did pre-COVID, and people starting to again, in the corporate world, that's very normal. But because athletes do it publicly, it's seen as very different, and it's a much easier target. And I think there has to be, there's some work to do in that area as well. And I think, were we talking about it recently or with other colleagues about this carbon footprint versus climate shadow idea? So not just thinking about, absolutely being accountable for our own actions, and trying to reduce our own impact on the environment as best we can through our lives. But climate shadow, acknowledging that we do live in a fossil fuel-based economy, and there are certain things where alternatives aren't palatable. If you are traveling, on a 5-hour flight, but you wanted to do that sustainably, and it ends up as 2-day travel on trains and coaches and costs 8 times the amount, etc. Sometimes, unfortunately, the way our society is currently set up, decisions have to be made to take a higher impact approach. And of course, we can work to offset that and reduce that, etc. But I do think there's this sort of middle ground of being passionate, but also accepting that the athletes, some aspects of their life are them doing their job the same way all of us do our jobs. And sometimes there is, the same as all of us, an environmental impact to that's inescapable. So I think you're absolutely right with the honesty, the authenticity, the credibility, but also we have to acknowledge that whilst their carbon footprint might be X, this idea of a climate shadow, where we can work to minimize our carbon footprint, we can try and reduce our environmental impact. But if we can use our platform to influence others and drive bigger change, that's creating this bigger climate shadow that has a positive, overall net positive effect.
I think the trouble is that generally we love tearing people down, particularly famous athletes. So a really contemporary issue is, just yesterday I read an article about Marcus Rashford, Man United footballer, who has done more than many people in the UK for societal good, particularly around children getting free meals at school who have come from deprived backgrounds. There's a picture of him in a nightclub with music star Wiley, who has been widely recognised as for being anti-Semitic in social media posts. But just because he was pictured with some person in a nightclub, sections of the media are kind of ripping him apart and killing him. And I suppose if you're an athlete that is going to use your voice and use your platform in such a pronounced way for good, I think there has to be some acceptance that at some point some sections of the media are going to come after you. But in hindsight, you'll get more positive recognition than negative recognition, but there will still be points where that's going to happen. And I think there just has to be an acceptance, because that's just the way the media, particularly in the UK, maybe the US as well, that's just the way it works, unfortunately.
And I think that's it. No matter what you do, if you put your head above the parapet to do anything, there is always going to be an impact, isn't it? There's always going to be an impact of that, good, bad, indifferent. Everyone's got an opinion. And now, unlike years ago, everyone has got a microphone to be able to voice that. But yeah, I think, again, the conversations we have with athletes, I'm sure you're the same, of there might be fallout, because if as soon as you start expressing an opinion on anything, environmental or otherwise, people are not going to agree with you, or people are going to disagree, or people are going to take offense, or people could easily take offense that we pretty much dedicate our lives to trying to enhance the environment. Like someone will find that a problem. That's just the way society is. It's just that was always the case. It's just we can hear everyone now. And naturally, as human beings, everyone focuses on the negatives rather than the positives in terms of that. But as you said, that acceptance of, if you do start talking about these things, there might be some fallout. But, we all have got fairly thick skins, and there's so much positive that can come out of that. It far outweighs perhaps some of those dissenting opinion, as we think about people talking out, athletes talking out about climate change or, environmental sustainability, etc. So I think you're right. I think there's that things aren't going to be rosy all the time, but then change never comes easy. And there's a huge, it's societal and systemic change that needs to happen if we're going to combat the climate crisis. So, we do all have to take the view and do that ourselves as well, and put ourselves out there in forums like this to talk about these things and tackle some of these trickier issues, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually can't get over the arrogance of people who tell athletes to stick to sport.
Oh, I know.
Just by virtue of your profession, you can't have an opinion. You can't have a political opinion or an opinion on wider societal issues. I mean, we don't apply the same logic to carpenters or postmen or people in other professions.
No.
So I don't understand. I think the sooner we actually push back against that, the better, really, because even if an athlete has a differing opinion to mine and different political views, they've got absolutely as much right to express it as I do.
Absolutely. I think you're right, Matt. I think we, again, it's probably a psychologist or a psychologist could come on and tell us exactly what the deal that's going on here. But I do think as human beings, we like to put people in boxes. We like to say that person's an actor, that person's a sports star, that person's a politician. And as soon as there's deviation from that, or people doing multiple things or having opinions, we're like, oh, hang on a second, I'd filed you in my athlete box. This is outrageous. Now you're going to start being, this over here as well. But again, only for existing athletes, retired athletes, pundits, commentators, most people have no problem with it. It's when current professional athletes do this that some people seem to have a problem with it. But yeah, there's politics has always been in sport. The environmental perhaps is new. The social impact, the social efforts has always been in sport in terms of that in some way since for probably hundreds of years in terms of this. And now I think the environmental element is probably just coming out more than it has done historically, and we're seeing more. But I'm also super heartened by efforts that we see in terms of supporting athletes in this effort, like Athletes of the World, like eco-athletes, like Players for the Planet, front runners, etc. I think there's a lot of resources now for athletes who do care about this to get that community, get that network, get that connection to be able to help them on that journey as well.
Sure. Yeah, it's all about, it's just a part of athlete safeguarding as well, because we talk about athlete safeguarding from a physical and mental point of view, which absolutely they should be. But I mean, athletes who've got climate anxiety, which a lot of them do. I mean, if I'm an athlete and I'm taking part in a sport that could be obsolete in 5 or 10 years because of climate change, then I'm concerned about my career. I'm concerned about the future of my sport. So actually looking at environment and climate should be a safeguarding issue for many sports organizations. How can I protect my athletes from feeling this way about this issue? How can we support them and get them through it? It's just the same as any other kind of mental health issues. That's just my opinion on it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, and in terms of, so we've kind of through the chat covered the fan engagement and athletes, etc. But is there other big issues you think the industry has to tackle now in terms of You know, we've seen, as we've both seen, so much progress in the last few years. We're starting to see bigger commitments. We're starting to see holistic and full-scale sustainability strategies from sports organisations. There's been a step change. It's still not as widespread as I think it should be, but there's been a step change in how seriously this topic is taken. But do you feel, you know, what do you feel are the biggest challenges in the nearer term that we have to tackle now before we can, as we progress along this journey, I guess?
Yeah, I'd like your opinion on this, because the thing that I see as holding sport back is a lack of education and training on behalf of some people that work in sport.
Yeah.
And that goes for all stakeholders. So, for example, I was at a conference about 2 or 3 months ago, and it was about sponsorship. The panel was about sponsorship. It wasn't anything to do with climate. It was just about sponsorship and how sponsors were working with the rights holders. Yeah. And there were a couple of sponsors in the room on the panel, a couple of rights holders, and the whole conversation was facilitated by young people from a university. They were kind of like the young change makers, the young people that you had at your Sport Positive. So very similar to that. And they were trying to kind of switch the conversation around to climate. One of the sponsors, their big kind of property, kind of the big asset is they sponsor a big skiing event.
Okay.
And they kind of tried to get it around to say, look, okay, so you work with a big skiing event. Have you worked on any activations around climate or sustainability? Which I thought was a very natural question.
Yeah.
And the guy who was answering it was absolutely puzzled by the question.
Oh, wow.
He's like, why should we focus on climate? No, we're here to talk about, fan engagement and trying to get some eyeballs on our brand. Why should we focus on it? And then it was kind of unpacked a little bit from that. Okay, the sport that you're sponsoring is under severe threat because of climate change. You're part of a big institution. I won't name the institution for obvious reasons, but that actually can have a big impact on reducing climate change. I think it was a bank actually. So, depending on where you invest your money, that could have a big impact on climate change. So obviously there are some synergies there, and there's some connection there, but absolutely just didn't get it. So I feel there's a lot to be done, focusing people who work in sport and work around sport on being trained and well versed in climate and understanding climate and how it affects their sport, how it impacts the brand, how it impacts the relationship. And why it's such a big issue, because these are the people who are making day-to-day decisions about, who we're going to partner with, how we're going to do things operationally. These day-to-day issues. We talk about this big strategic issue, but it's the day-to-day stuff that really matters. So that's what I'd like to see: people working in all levels of sport, being trained as a matter of course on climate and how their decisions affect climate.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant in terms of the idea and the focus, and I think we're starting to see more of it in some pockets, but nowhere near widespread, I would say, and nowhere near enough. But yeah, to your point, operationally, and I'm sure you have this conversation a lot as well. So I've been asked so many times, should an organisation have a sustainability director or not? Because shouldn't it be everyone's responsibility? Which is a great question. And I think, to this point, and I'm leading into the training and the education piece in terms of, whilst I think having someone who's responsible for the sustainability of an organisation is crucial, because it shows that the organisation has resourced that effectively, that they believe in it. Usually decisions like that of recruiting those people have to be signed off at a board level or a senior management level. There's an attribution of costs and time and resources. So there's an understanding that sustainability is taken seriously within inside the organisation. But that one person can't drive change across an entire organisation, be it as club, federation, governing body, etc. Every sector of that business, that sport organisation, has to understand how it intersects with their decision making. If, as you said, it's on the commercial team, procurement, facilities, marketing, communication, sales, whatever it is, they will intersect change decision making, and every single part of an organization has a role to play. So my answer whenever I'm asked that is like both. You have to have, if you have someone who's responsible for it, you have someone whose job it is to ensure this happens, but that one person can't do everything. That person is just to help it roll out. But this training and the education is so important, because if you don't have that, what you can end up is a very siloed effort where perhaps operationally an organization is doing really, really well, but they're not communicating it internally or externally. And therefore, while it still has merit, it's nowhere near reaching its optimal output of changing behaviours or reaching staff, full-time staff, casual staff that we see a lot of in sports organisations who hold events, etc., fans, teams, sponsors, suppliers, etc. If it's just kept in the operations, we're losing all of those other benefits. And that's why, like with Sport Positive Leagues this year, we added a category on education, that mind. So right. For football club, looking at not just educating, there's a lot of youth and fan education that happens in local schools and different things, which is great. And, there's some staff education that happens, but is there player education as well? So that, all pockets of the organisation are aware of what the clubs do and are aware of the impacts they have and how they can change decisions. So I think that's a really good one, Matt, in terms of that education and training piece. And although we're seeing some of it, I think we need to see a lot more.
What do you think, Claire? What do you think is going to move the needle on this in the kind of near term?
I think the biggest challenges I feel as though in terms of one of the biggest challenge I think that we are going to have to square the circle on, get across, have open conversations about is sports sponsorship, because there's so many sports organisations now that have incredible sustainability strategies. They've been doing it in some cases for decades, really well thought out, holistic, and fully encapsulated, unbelievable efforts, but it's hampered by ownership or partners or suppliers or sponsors, where again this quadrant that aren't inside the industry like we are, and they don't necessarily see the years, decades of work that have gone into embedding sustainability in the DNA of the organization, simply say, how can they possibly be sustainable if they're taking money from a heavy carbon industry, from an airline, from a car manufacturer, from a bank that invests in fossil fuels, etc. So I know the Rapid Transition Alliance and their advertising report, they had a report out last year, Sweat Not Oil, about sponsorship in sport. And it's something we've tried to look at with Sport Positive Leagues as well, but it's just really complicated. And I think, I've got no problem with saying that out loud. It's so complicated because a lot of these are legacy sponsorships. There's actually, even though environmentally there's negatives, there are often huge amounts of positive activations that are happening in communities, in society, on societal issues, in other areas. So it's not black and white, and there's a lot of work to do it. But I see that, I think, as potentially a big issue that will hold us back in terms of progress, because we know that all of this work is starting to happen now in sports organisations, and it's being taken really seriously, and a huge amount of work is being done. But as we start going out more and we start talking about that more, I fear this is going to be the big impact, which, to be honest, it should be, because it's part of the dialogue and it's part of the conversation about that. But I see that as hampering the potential of what some of these sports organisations can do. And it might be that there isn't organisations out there that will finance certain sports organisations to the tune that they need for their operations. And post-COVID, a lot of sports organisations are in very precarious positions financially. But yeah, I definitely see that as a big issue we're going to hear more about, and we're going to have to start seriously tackling in the next couple of years.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because firstly, with sponsorship, we've spoken about this previously, but first of all, where do you draw the line? Because, like, obviously oil and gas companies, obviously not great for the planet, but do you draw the line at fast food outlets, fizzy drink producers, alcoholic beverages, gaming? And that brings on to kind of a next point. Yeah, betting. Whenever I read about sport and the growth of sport from a financial point of view, from a revenue point of view, particularly in the US now, all I ever read about is gambling and NFTs. That is all I read about now. I don't know too much about NFTs, but I know that there is a questionable environmental impact that is linked to NFTs and blockchain, although I don't know the full extent of it. And
there's an impact for sure, isn't there? It's all cloud-based, etc. There's a lot of energy intensive to mine. But, so there's, of course, an impact to that. So, yeah, go on.
And not just that. I mean, I think that there's some question marks about these fan tokens that are being produced and sold to fans, about the benefit for fans, because I think in some cases fans are buying something that is actually pretty worthless in many ways. They get to vote on issues that are pretty uninteresting, like, what music should the team run out to and all this kind of stuff, but they don't have a real stake in the club, or they can't help with any decisions. So I'm concerned that sport, like you say, sport in many cases, lots of sports organisations are having trouble making ends meet, particularly in a post-COVID world. They have to look for revenue in any way possible. But I think then there's a need, and this is probably easy for me to say on the outside, but a need for sport to think a little bit more creatively than just jump on this NFT betting bandwagon, because that kind of flies in the face of everything around social and environmental sustainability. So I'm not quite sure where we go from there, really.
Yeah. And that's it. I think there's, it's part of the dialogue, isn't it? And I think neither of us are holding ourselves up as having, the answers. No, guys, we'll fix this, don't worry. There isn't, I think we have to acknowledge it's incredibly complex, but we also have to start having conversations around it about, as you said, we move away from heavy carbon industries, and then the next available industry that's got the kind of finance to fill that vacuum is something else that maybe has equal or worse environmental and societal issues attached to it, etc. There's, we don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul in that instance, but understanding more about that, and in some ways, understandably, the financials and the side of that can be a little bit opaque with these businesses, which again is the way it is. But in terms of that, which clubs can we look at? Which organisations can we look at that maybe have got around that or done more? Even you can't have a sustainability in sport conversation without Forest Green popping up and Dale's work. But I know a lot of organisations will say, well, it's a small club in a fairly rural part of England, and they haven't got the same sponsorship needs that a lot of massive tier 1 professional sports clubs have. But Dale spoke openly at our summit last year about how even during COVID they were able to double their commercial revenues. So whatever the yardstick is, through their environmental metrics, they were able to double what they'd previously brought in. So I think there is money obviously out there that's more ethical to come by. Whether it's at the scale that a lot of these clubs need, I don't know. But I do think even in that instance, even if club sports organisations say, look, we've looked and the money isn't out there that we need, can we at least ensure that there's a lot of purpose-driven activations attached to these sorts of money? So at least while they're still accepting sponsorship from certain organisations, that we can see positive impacts being used for it. And I think that probably is the case with some organisations, but we might just not hear about it as much. But that, I think, this commercial, and also perhaps commercial teams understanding this a lot more. Again, coming back to the training and education, it might be that, I'm sure it is the case that in some organisations, climate change and environmental sustainability doesn't even factor into decision making when sales teams are talking about sponsorship activations and what they get. So again, that comes back to that education and training piece. If those teams and those individuals responsible for those decisions understand the impacts, they might approach these deals in a slightly different way.
On a more positive note, what can you share with us about the upcoming Sport Positive League, Claire? Can you give us a little bit of info?
No spoilers, but we've worked really hard. So we've updated again. So this is it's the English Premier League Sport Positive League. So for those who aren't aware, we do the environmental sustainability metrics of all 20 Premier League clubs, and we've done the same for Bundesliga, are in the process of Ligue 1 and others as well. So it's the third year that will be we've done it, and it will be announced via BBC Sport again early Feb 2022. But so we've changed. We've made the points again more difficult. Every year we make it more difficult to get the top points. So broadly, every category now you have to, strategies and policies have to be in place to get to the top points. And that's obviously because whilst good ad hoc things might be happening, if it's not embedded in the DNA of the organisation, it's not been signed off at a board level, it isn't in strategies and policies that run throughout the business, those sorts of great things can stop or are forgotten about. So we always give higher points for strategies and policies. We make sure we've added in different bonus points this year around third-party verifications, etc. So people are sort of holding themselves to account on their efforts. We've added more points in for external commitments to net zero and others. And then we also added in 2 new categories on biodiversity and education as well.
Nice.
So lots more going on, but incredibly, I know we haven't got loads of time left, and I want to get a quick question in before we finish. But I think just broadly, whilst I won't give anything away about the results of that, I would just say, you know, have a look at it, because in the past 3 years, the amount that the clubs are doing compared to when we launched it in the 2018-19 season is unbelievable. Like, there's so much information, there's so much progress. And no matter, as we always say, no matter where clubs fall in our league, the league table is really just to present the information. What the clubs are doing is the most important element, and all the clubs are doing brilliant things. All the clubs are progressing. All the clubs are doing more, have done more, and continue to do more, and there'll be more out in the next 12 months. So super exciting progress, I would say.
Excellent.
Yes. So thank you for that. Yes. So the leagues is great. So just to finish off, because the time's gone so quick, we always have so much to talk about. Just to finish off, the one thing I'm going to ask everyone at the end of this podcast as we go forward is just about sort of what you've learned sort of vibe. So you said, as you said, you've been doing the sustainability report now for 4 years. Not a top tip, but if we think of the people who are listening to this, either from your perspective, what you wish you'd known 4 years ago in terms of, you know, the things that you've seen and what's happened, and how you could have maybe sped up that process or thought about things in a different way, or a pet peeve that you kind of think we really need to stop doing this now and we need to move on. So something in that, what you've learned vibe from your experience in this space and everything you've seen.
That is a very, very tricky question. No, it's a good question though. I suppose the thing that I've learned most, and I learned it very quickly at the start of my journey 4 or 5 years ago, was that speaking to people who care, people who are knowledgeable, people who want to make a difference is always worth doing. And collaboration is the only way forward, I think, in any of this. And this isn't just factor into sport, it factors into everything, because we've got, and it sounds very, very, very cliche, but we've got one major overarching goal, which is to save ourselves, our planet, humanity, our children, everyone that comes after us. And if we can do that in a small way through sport, that is obviously a really ambitious and admirable goal to have. But we have to do it without competition. We have to do it working together, understanding where our knowledge gaps are and where other people have knowledge, and working together and really trying to find ways to put this jigsaw puzzle together. So I suppose if there are people in this space who are just starting out, students potentially, or people who want to do things, who are working within sport, who want to make their organizations better prepared to face the climate crisis and things around that, is really get in touch and speak to people and really build this network out more, so that we can have more knowledge sharing opportunities, so we can have more frank discussions about this, so we can really get to grips with what the issues are and how we can tackle them. And I suppose that's my biggest lesson, I guess.
I love it. I think that's a brilliant moment to end on. And in terms of that, I think that's an awesome answer in terms of what you've learned, and to help people on their journeys as well. So Matt, it's been such a pleasure, mate, to have you on this inaugural The Climate of Sport podcast. I cannot recommend more that people read the sustainability report, sign up to your newsletter, subscribe to the podcast. Like, everything that comes out is just so important, useful information. It really is the go-to place.
Okay, you're making me blush.
All of these, I know. That is always my intention. No, it's an incredible resource, and people who are active in this space will know about it. But for anyone who's just new to the space or learning more, it's an unbelievable resource for you. Not just with current news, but historic stuff as well. So please check out the sustainability report. Thank you. That was Matt, founder of the Sustainability Report, on this first Climate of Sport podcast. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for listening to the Climate of Sport podcast. Please like and subscribe, and get in touch if you want to share information about the work that you're doing, if you want to appear as a guest, or you want to recommend guests, or you just have ideas of conversations you'd like us to have. You can get in touch by emailing info@sportpositivesummit.com.